Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today for episode 590 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am joined by Dr. Luke O'Neill to talk more about life and science. So listeners, I hope you enjoy learning more about the life and career of another researcher in today's episode. And if you want to meet even more great people in science, you can check out our website at peoplebehindthescience.com to peruse previous episodes and our show notes. Now today, Luke is going to tell us more about his life, his career, and his research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our fantastic people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am delighted to be speaking with our guest, Dr. Luke O'Neill. So, Luke, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Thank you, Marie. I'm very well.
Well, we are delighted to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you more about your work and your science. So let me take a moment first to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, Luke is professor and chair of biochemistry in the School of Biochemistry and Immunology at Trinity College Dublin. He is also an author of 3 popular science books. And in addition, Luke co-founded Inflazome, a company dedicated to developing therapeutics to address unmet needs in inflammatory diseases. He was awarded his bachelor's degree in natural sciences with an emphasis in biochemistry from Trinity College Dublin and his PhD in pharmacology from the University of London. Afterwards, Luke accepted a Medical Research Council postdoctoral fellowship to conduct research at Strangeways Research Laboratory in Cambridge. And he has received numerous awards and honors for his exceptional research, including the Royal Dublin Society and the Irish Times Robert Boyle Medal for Scientific Excellence, the Royal Irish Academy Gold Medal for Life Sciences, and the European Federation of Immunology Society's Medal. In addition, Luke is an elected member of the Royal Irish Academy, a member of the European Molecular Biology Organization, and a fellow of the Royal Society. And in our interview today, Luke, we are excited to get to know you more as a scientist, but also more as a person in general. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Oh, God, that's a good question, isn't it? Well, I'm so busy now. With COVID-19, it's like 24/7. But music is my big passion, actually, Marie, after science, I guess. I play guitar. I'm in a band called the Metabollix, which we do gigs. No gigs now at the moment, of course, but music is my big other activity, I guess.
Oh, phenomenal. So do you have a lot of science-themed songs then?
We do. In fact, the band has 3 doctors. We have a neurologist and we have a intensivist and we have a couple of biochemists. So we're very well qualified. We've done songs like, I'll give an example. We did a gig at Halloween last year and we did the Monster Mash. You may be familiar with that song. Mm-hmm. I was working in the lab late one night, you see. So if we can get a scientific relevancy, we did.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Well, I'm glad to hear you're able to express yourself musically to maybe take a little bit of a break from the science, even if there's some science themes interwoven there. But I'd love to talk about your work as well. Luke, you are doing some fascinating research. So how do you describe what you do to someone who's not in science or not in your field?
Well, I'm an immunologist, first and foremost, Marie. So that means I work on the immune system. And I've been working on the immune system for 35 years now, I guess. And as we know, the immune system defends us against nasty germs. That's its main function. And of course, highly relevant with COVID-19, clearly. And I've worked on infectious diseases over the years. For example, malaria. I've done stuff on certain viruses, chikungunya virus, for example. But my main focus has been more what I call inflammatory diseases. I'm talking about things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. I've done stuff on rheumatoid arthritis. I've done stuff on Alzheimer's disease. Now, you might think these all sound quite distinct, but in truth, they're all defects in the immune response. And the immune response goes a bit rogue and goes out of control and begins to beat up your joints, say in rheumatoid, or beats up your hippocampus in Alzheimer's. And we're very interested in trying to understand then the underlying mechanisms, I suppose, and what's going wrong. And then I unravel the component parts. My main job in the past few years has been trying to find out the parts of the immune system that are dysfunctional. And then, of course, to try and design new medicines then to correct that dysfunction. And we've got a couple of very interesting discoveries lately that might give rise to new treatments for these diseases. And then lastly, I guess with COVID is an inflammatory disease. In this case, your lungs become inflamed. And it turns out the same kind of processes are in COVID as would be in these other diseases you see. So I've got 3 projects running now on the COVID-19 area, especially with the view to new therapies that might be used on people who get sick with COVID and try to help them.
Certainly. Well, Luke, I look forward to diving into some of the detail of these projects as we go through our conversation today. But I'd love to talk about motivation. I know you mentioned this is maybe a particularly busy time for you in your lab. What really keeps you motivated or inspired? Do you have a quote or a saying or a mantra that runs through your mind?
If you're a scientist, your number one passion is just curiosity, I suppose. From the very start, you're just really interested in trying to understand things. And curiosity is a key human trait, I suppose. And then, of course, in my case, that curiosity happened to be to do with diseases. So the big thrill becomes if you can find new treatments for disease. So a major motivator for us is make good discoveries as a scientist and then see if you can apply that then to try to come up with better treatments for patients with all these diseases. So that's the key driver. Also, I'm in a university, so I like teaching and educating students and writing and all the rest of it. So the communication part is a big thrill as well. I must say, a good quote, good Lord, that's a hard one. Well, Carl Sagan said that there's always something out there waiting to be discovered. So that kind of is one of the key mantras that we use.
Oh, I love it. Keeps you wanting to go back in for more, right?
Yeah, it's never ending. Yeah, that's the other thing.
Well, it sounds like in the university setting, then you're able to serve as a role model and train and teach other students. But I'm curious to hear about some of your own role models. So, Luke, have there been people or scientists that you've looked up to over the course of your career or your life that really stand out in your mind that have helped you or maybe just inspired you?
We all have mentors, don't we, as we go through life, and they're so important to us. And that's why education is really important. And the main role of education, remember, is to draw out people's strengths and help them. And through my life, I've had some great teachers and mentors. It began when I was a teenager in school. I had a biology teacher called Fran Mooney. He was a big inspiration. And then when I went to university, I met some really clever people, and they kind of inspired me. A guy called Keith Tipton, I'd mentioned him. He was head of biochemistry. I got his job in the end, actually. He was head of biochemistry in Trinity. And then when I went to the UK then to do my PhD, again, you just meet really compelling people who kind of convince you of certain things. A guy called Charles Dinarillo. And he's in the University of Colorado now. He was a big inspiration in my field of investigation. And then I went to Cambridge to work as a postdoc, and a guy called Jerry Saklavala, he was my supervisor there, and he was an outstanding scientist. And he taught me really, hopefully, how to be a good scientist, because it is a training where you need to learn. And then more broadly, famous people, Charles Darwin was always the inspiration, because he's the person who discovered evolution and described evolution. And everything in biology is explained through evolution in a way. So I always mention him as a big inspiration.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've had wonderful people to look up to, both historic figures and these people who are more kind of hands-on training you day to day. And we mentioned that your undergraduate training was there at Trinity, but I'm curious to maybe rewind back a little bit farther. So where did your interest in science or disease initially begin? Where did that passion start for you, Luke?
I don't know what it was. I was in school and the teachers there would have been telling us stuff about biology, and that got my imagination. I remember amazingly when I was like maybe 12 or 13, I'm from a place called Bray, County Wicklow. And Wicklow has a mountain range. They wouldn't be like mountains like the Rockies by any means. We call them mountains, but they aren't. And I read somewhere that area had been covered in ice in the last ice age. And these massive glaciers had carved out the valleys there. And I used to go hiking in those valleys. And that really got my imagination. You know? So I guess I always had that curiosity about the world and trying to explain things from a scientific point of view. And then, strangely enough, there was no science in my family. So it was not as if I had my parents or anything like that. But I don't know, I think it was just some strange fascination about things, you see. And then I eventually realized this could be a job. I could actually become a scientist. So that was a real step up, I suppose. And you can do it for a living, trying to discover things. So it goes right back through my childhood. Although I would say when I was in school, I still loved English literature and things. I wasn't just focusing on science either. That just began to become the thing as I got a bit older.
Certainly. So it sounds like this curiosity has been a theme throughout your life. But I'm curious, you mentioned you at some point just sort of discovered that this could be a job that you could do. What were some of these key steps that took you from this curious kid thinking about the mountains, thinking about nature, to becoming an actual scientist?
I kind of realized, as we all do, you got to get a job eventually, haven't you? You got to make a living. And I remember seeing in a hospital, there was a clinical biochemistry department. And that intrigued me, that they were using science to measure things in patients. And that's what clinical biochemistry, it takes a blood sample, say, you can measure and then diagnose disease. And I suddenly thought, oh, there's a job there. And I'm wondering then. And I did biochemistry in university, partly with the notion of maybe becoming a clinical biochemist. So that was always sort of in my mind. But then I realized I could do research, and that became an important driver. And to do research, you had to do a PhD, you see, as part of the training. And then I did a PhD next. And then when I was doing my PhD, my project as a PhD student was trying to find anti-inflammatory medicines. So I knew there was a whole pharmaceutical industry trying to do that. And I realized, there could be jobs in a drug company, say. But I was relentlessly drawn to university because I still wanted to have the educational communication part and the research combined. I kind of had the best of both worlds because I've also started companies myself, you see, that have spun out from my lab as well. So kind of eventually it became like a mix of different activities. And I guess as you begin to look around, you see different employment possibilities. And to me, I could never have worked in a bank or become a lawyer. I'm not knocking those jobs now, but I couldn't do that. So, I mean, the biggest thrill as a scientist is you see something for the first time that nobody's ever seen before. And that really got me going. I thought, wouldn't it be great to be that kind of thing? It's sort of like Christopher Columbus, and you see the New World in front of you, the first European to see that, I suppose. So that got me. And then when I began to make discoveries, and I was lucky enough in my PhD to make one or two, and then all through my career, I've made little discoveries here and there. Each one is a little thrill. And then I realized I can get paid for this. That's great.
Absolutely. And at the start of our conversation, you mentioned some of the projects maybe leading to some of these exciting discoveries in your lab. But Luke, what is the project that you are maybe the most excited about right now that you want to tell us about in a little bit more detail?
Oh, that's like trying to choose a child in your family if you have kids. Lately, we've had a very interesting finding about COVID-19, which of course is all in our minds. And now this is a work in progress, Marie, by the way. If you're a scientist, things can backfire because you can't reproduce, the experiments go wrong, or
Sure.
We discover an artifact, as we call it. But we've got some really interesting data to do with coagulation. So as you may know, COVID-19 is effectively a disease of blood clotting, and people with severe disease, clots form in their lungs and they can't breathe and they get little clots in their brains. And there's a big effort to try and stop that happening. And we've discovered a drug that might interfere with coagulation. And it's targeting a process that my lab's been working on for 2 or 3 years now. There's a molecule, get ready for a jargon word, it's called itaconate. Mm-hmm. And your body makes this molecule to suppress inflammation. It's a natural way to dampen down inflammation. Because, of course, like any complex system, there's brakes and accelerators. We have a natural brake on inflammation. And we began exploring that to see if that could be used in COVID. And then we managed to show this could actually affect coagulation. And then even more excitingly, there's a drug called dimethyl fumarate. It's also called Tecfidera as the trade name. That is very like itaconate. And now we're trying to press people to do a clinical trial. It's used in MS, actually, multiple sclerosis, which is another inflammatory disease. But we think, could this be repurposed for COVID? So we're in the middle of this, and it's a very exciting time for us because, first of all, we're trying to prove it. We have data, but we'd like more data. I've got a big Zoom call on Monday with some hematology experts who work in coagulation, for instance. We're going to measure these things in patients from our hospital here at St. James. So I've got a whole program of work ahead of us to see if this pans out. But that's one that's exciting me because nobody's linked those before. Nobody's linked itaconate or dimethyl fumarate to coagulation. So that connection, I think, could be very exciting.
Oh, very interesting. And for your lab specifically, you sort of mentioned that you had pivoted to some of these COVID projects. Now there's 3 different ones going on in your lab right now. What was that experience like early last year as COVID was sort of unraveling in the country and across the world? What made you decide to jump in and start doing research on it?
I think we could not do it, I mean, the whole world was in a state of turmoil, as you know, and it still is. We're still in the thick of it, of course, as you know. So if you can lend a hand, you're kind of obliged to in a way. And secondly, it's all we could talk about, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's uppermost in your mind. And then I began to think, we could do 2 or 3 projects here. And then very importantly, actually, I first came across COVID back in January. I was at a conference in Rotterdam. And it was a big viruses and immune system conference, which I was invited to speak at. And I met an expert on SARS, which of course is in the same family as SARS-CoV-2. And he says, this is going to be really bad. And I said, tell me more. This is like the second week in January, almost a year ago to the day. And at that stage, we didn't appreciate how bad it was going to get, So he began to say to me, let's work together, let's collaborate. And we did. And then he's been involved in some of this work. So it's kind of talking to an expert and then realizing my work could apply to this disease. And let's face it, it is the central medical problem at the moment. So it's a bit of a relief in some ways to be working on it because you feel like you're doing something because we all feel so helpless, don't we? And here was a situation where my lab could make a contribution and then I could pour my team onto it. And they were over the moon to be working on this disease because they want to make a difference. And these are younger people who, of course, have a passion to make a difference. I've got like 4 of the team now, and they're all either PhD students or newly qualified PhDs. They're now working on this together. So it's really great to see that as well.
Phenomenal. And I think COVID specifically has caused a lot of challenges in general for research, but there's also just sort of more normal, I guess, everyday challenges that you run into as a scientist. So can you take us through a time in your own career, your own experiences, or maybe last week, Luke, where you were really struggling with something or had a major failure, and tell us how you work through these sorts of situations?
How about today, Maria? I mean, every day. To be a scientist is to embrace failure. Let me start with that statement, because often the experiments don't work. And I feel so sorry for the people in the lab. They spend 6 months on something and then it's for nothing. And it's just the way it is. Sometimes you can't do the experiment. Technically, it just doesn't work. And you had an idea and you try a new technique and it can't be used in the way you want. I mean, if you're doing biology especially, many things can go wrong. Like your cell culture might get contaminated with some bacteria that you didn't expect or whatever it might be. And this is standard for a scientist. And my job as the leader of the lab is to tell everybody, just keep going. We'll get better. And then today we had a bit of a disappointment. What you do is that you make a discovery, you then want to publish it because then you want the world to see it so they can build on it. I mean, the reason why we publish is to hopefully get other people to develop our discoveries. And so we made a discovery. I had a very talented postdoc in my lab who's from Minnesota, actually. Her name was Myra Runch. So she'd worked on this for the last 2.5 years. We wrote it up, sent it into a journal, and they came back and kicked us in the ass. It was like 3 very aggressive referee reports. Now, after we've spoken today, I'm going to sit down with Myra, we'll go through the comments. We think we probably went to the wrong journal because in science, you pitch your stuff at a certain journal, and I think it may have been the wrong journal. You know what I mean? In other words, we could have gone to a more specialized one for this topic. But that was a disappointment. No one likes rejection. Now, we're going to get through it. We will reconfigure it. We'll maybe leave some data out. We might do more experiments. So it's always a journey that you're on, and you're trying to deal with disappointment as you go along.
Certainly. So how do you recover, or how do you maybe keep the lab spirits up after one of these big disappointments?
Well, you go into a room, you close the door and you scream, then you come out again. No, that's my old boss, my mentor, Jerry Stockdale. When this happened to him, he would take the referee reports. So what happens is you submit your paper and then you get what I call referee reports from the editor. He would put them in a drawer and then leave them there for 3 days and then go back and read them again. So what I do is I kind of just calm down and I say, what's a good way out of this? Can we figure a way through this? Can we come up with a plan? I think no more than talking about COVID, if you feel that you're in a helpless situation, that will really drag you down. So I'm always looking for the light at the end of the tunnel, shall we say, and use your nouns to try to figure a way through it. So that's the way you deal with disappointment. It's like a punch to the solar plexus initially, and you go, oh, God. But if you just calm down, bit of perspective, nothing severe has happened here, and then you just have to think about it and then draw up the next steps. That's the best way to deal with disappointment. Sometimes you got to write things off them, Marie, as well, and go, look, I'm banging my head against a brick wall. I'm going to move on from this. And people can be reluctant to do that because you're kind of wedded to it in a way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing with me and our listeners how you work through some of these struggles that are so unfortunately common in science, but we don't just want to talk about the difficult times. I'd love to share some of your successes as well. So, Luke, do you have a favorite story of success from your group, whether it was a big one or just a small but particularly meaningful one?
The biggest success we've had began in 2010, to be honest, I suppose. It's really over 10 years ago. This specific project began in my lab, and we work on a cell type called macrophages. Now, they are the frontline set of the immune system. And they're called macrophage. That means big eater, by the way. That's where the name was coined from. They eat things. They eat bacteria. They eat viruses, very importantly. But they also clear up noxious things that build up in your body. So, for example, if you've got gout, that disease, uric acid crystals build up and the macrophage clears them. That's its job. It's like a vacuum cleaner, I suppose. More seriously, if you have Alzheimer's disease, a protein called beta amyloid builds up in your brain. And again, the macrophage goes in and tries to clear that. And that disease progresses because the macrophage can't clear it all. The stuff is building up too much. The macrophage gets very frustrated. I actually use the word frustration for macrophages there. Now, beginning in 2001, a Swiss scientist called Jörg Chopp discovers in the macrophage the sensor of the stuff it's phagocytosing. So if you like, the little thing inside the vacuum cleaner that can detect what's being taken off. And it's a protein called NLRP3. Now, I know this sounds like a real mouthful, most scientific terms do, but it's just a protein in the macrophage that can detect stuff that's been taken up. And NLRP3 gets the macrophage to drive inflammation. Now, inflammation is designed to clear all this stuff and soup up the recovery phase of injury. So Jörg had discovered a key on switch, if you like, for inflammation. And then my lab began to work on it. And then we had a discovery in 2010 to do with diabetes. Turns out that type 2 diabetes is an inflammatory disease. So it gets your pancreas is damaged and all kinds of things. And we showed NLRP3 was driving that damage. And that was quite nice because we'd found a key component and that might be useful to block in type 2 diabetes. But then lots of papers appear of NLRP3 in Alzheimer's, in Parkinson's, in gout, I just mentioned, and all these different diseases, in heart disease, because cholesterol is getting sensed, you see. And then I began to look for a drug to block it. And then amazingly, we found one. And it was a drug made by the drug company Pfizer. And they had discovered this drug maybe 15 years before and didn't know what they had. They hadn't realized it was an NLRP3 in it. They knew it was anti-inflammatory, but didn't know about NLRP3. And they dropped it for various reasons. And then we formed a company and we began to make better molecules that followed on from the Pfizer molecule. In other words, we kind of optimized what Pfizer had. And you won't believe this, Marie, but it works in all these diseases in animals. So we can stop Alzheimer's in mice. We can stop Parkinson's.
Oh, wow.
We can do all these remarkable effects. And now we're going into humans. We're about to start 6 clinical trials. A big drug company called Roche, they bought us because you have to get bought eventually because they've got deep pockets and they can fund the trials. So now, literally, just before I spoke to you, I had a big call with Roche to discuss some of the projects they're doing. And now we hope that this drug will make a difference. And we're about to start clinical trials in humans in some of these diseases I just mentioned. So it's a very exciting time. So I think the discovery of that molecule, the drug, if you like, and blocking NLRP3 and working on its role in these diseases, that probably stands out as my discovery I'm proudest of at the moment.
Oh, that is phenomenal. It sounds like it's been a 10-year journey, though. How or when do you celebrate this sort of exciting success?
Well, exactly. In fact, it's been a 35-year journey. Because remember I mentioned a guy called Dino Rillo earlier? Mm-hmm. He got me into this pathway in 1986 or 87. So it goes back to him. I give him credit. So it's a long journey. Yeah, it's amazing. In science, that's not unusual, Marie, as you probably know. Things can take forever. I mean, we're astounded at the speed of researching COVID because of the emergence. Like a vaccine developed in 10 months is amazing. So it does take time, it must be said, to make these discoveries. But how you celebrate? Well, we can't because of COVID. We couldn't have a big party to celebrate. When our paper came out in 2015, my lab celebration is so important because they work so hard and there's so many setbacks. So what we do is we have a few drinks on our balcony where we have our coffee and then we go to a restaurant and we get trashed. That's how we better describe it, together, responsibly. But we always have a great night out. We go for a meal. In fact, sadly enough, Marie, we had 2 other discoveries last year, which I won't go into because it's a bit too much detail. But we had 2 big discoveries and I was so proud of it. We were going to go to Poland on a retreat.
Oh, wow.
One of the postdocs on the project was from Poland, and we were going to go to the town Copernicus was born in, the guy who said that the Earth goes around the sun. So I planned to have a retreat to have a celebration. But again, COVID put pay to that, sadly.
Well, when you are all able to get back together again, you're going to have to make up for lost time in terms of celebrating, it sounds like.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the hope, isn't it?
And I know travel for science specifically is a big part of the job. And it's been really disruptive, I think, not to have this travel for conferences and things lately. But when you think back maybe to previous years, happier times, if you will, I guess, what is one of your favorite places you've traveled to for science?
Well, you're dead right. I mean, my life changed immeasurably since last March because I would be on the road probably a third of the time. And that's one of the big thrills of being a scientist, by the way, is international travel, because you go to visit collaborators, you visit companies like we have done with our company, you go to conferences, of course, you go to universities. I mean, it's superb. People don't realize how social science can be. I went to a conference in Mauritius once, South Africa, beautiful island. That was great. I remember that vividly. And my favorite city, though, is actually San Francisco. And I did a sabbatical there just over a year ago. I spent time in Stanford and also in a company actually called Colitis. I visited them. But San Francisco was such a fantastic place for science. And obviously you have all the great universities there as well and biotech and all that. So I think that's probably my best place for visiting.
Thank you for sharing some of your favorite places. And as a scientist, I think it's easy to get sucked into the literature, to live in the lab and spend all your time there. And we try to encourage our listeners to get a little balance in their life and do a little reading for fun. And I know you're an author yourself, so we'll definitely put your books on our website. But I'm curious to hear if you have any other books that you'd like to recommend for me and our listeners to add to our reading lists.
Well, I'm very glad you're plugging my book, Marie. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Yes, please read my book. It's called Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the science. But a really important book, going back on you're asking me questions about my past there, was Isaac Asimov. He's a science fiction writer. He had a guide to science, which was fantastic. Now, I guess it's probably 20, 30 years old now, but it's superb, especially for teenagers. I always recommend that as a great book about science. And he's such a fantastic writer. So there's one that would come to mind. Other science books I've read recently, Yuval Harari's Sapiens, you would have come across that one. Mm-hmm. Jared Diamond, he's one of my big heroes as well. He did a great book called The Third Chimpanzee, which is superb. So there's a few. They go back a few years, I guess. More recently, I read a great book last year. It was about a guy called William Campbell. It's called Chasing the Worm. And Bill Campbell won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for discovering drugs that can kill parasitic worms. And he won the Nobel Prize because he cured a thing called river blindness, which is caused by parasitic worms. And it's his biography. I tell his story because he was born in Donegal. He's Ireland's only Nobel laureate in medicine. And he went to Trinity, my university. So there's a really good book called Chasing the Worm. I'd recommend that. Claire O'Connell co-wrote it with William Campbell.
Oh, phenomenal. Well, thank you so much for these excellent book recommendations. I look forward to adding them to our website for our listeners. And I think as scientists, we're often portrayed a particular way in the media. And I think some of these scientific books out there can help sort of break these stereotypes. But as we are thinking about our colleagues, these are funny, creative, amazing people that don't necessarily fit the stereotypes I think that a lot of people still have about what scientists are like. So do you have a story or a tradition or an experience from your own career, Luke, that you can tell us about that maybe goes contrary to some of these scientific stereotypes to help break them?
You're right. I mean, most people think scientists are like they're nerdy people in labs and lab coats and they've got very bad social skills and whatever it might be and all that kind of thing. And there are some people like that, of course, and very often they're the best scientists, by the way, because they're so focused on what they do. But scientists are just like any other human being. We all have the same worries and fears, and also our interests are quite wide, but they're remarkably creative, many scientists. So, and music turns out to be quite a common feature. So often in the old days, when I go to a conference, there'd be like a conference dinner at the end of the conference, and I would get up and play some music for the delegates. And then lots of other scientists would turn up as well. So we'd bring our guitars with us, and then we'd have a bit of a music session to entertain the delegates at the end. And in fact, in 2017, I had a big conference, which I organised myself in Dublin. The Keystone organisation actually organised it, but I was one of the organisers. And they asked me, because it was Dublin, to put a really good band together. And I did. And that's why this band, the Metabollix, that was our first gig at this big conference. And there were hundreds of people.
Oh, wow.
The good news is, really, on this story, we invited up, I think, 3 other scientists who were at the conference. Richard Flavelle, Doug Green, John O'Shea. And these now, you wouldn't think that they would be rockers because they're quite serious scientists. But they all got up and we all played together. We had a great old party. So there's a little story to buck the stereotype.
That is phenomenal. Well, it sounds like you've had a wonderful experience and shared this love of music with other scientists out there, which I think is so important to break some of the seriousness of what you do, because you are working to answer some really difficult and important questions. And oftentimes funding, staff, technology, feasibility, all these barriers are in your way. But if we removed them, Luke, what is the one question that you would want to answer most with unlimited resources?
I am all about new medicines, ultimately. I mean, that's really what drives me. So I would love to see much better therapies for neurodegenerative diseases. So things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's that I mentioned. Now, our drug might have a role in this, of course, but there's many yet slip in this business. So I would put a huge focus into that, because I think the aging population, as we know, we're all getting older, and these diseases are devastating. So now there is loads of investment going into them, by the way, and the Michael J. Fox Foundation, for instance, that they gave Inflazome some funding for our project. But I would put a huge amount of effort into neurodegeneration, because these are severe diseases. They're going up in incidence. They cause such damage to people's lives and their families and so on. And then I might have a second one, if you don't mind. We have to think about vaccines. Look what's happening with COVID. I would ramp up vaccination campaigns now against malaria, against TB. These are still massive killers. And I would ramp it up against cancer. And in fact, there's more and more optimism that will crack cancer through the immune system. So again, they'd be things I'd be investing in more and more.
Well, all very worthy causes, Luke. Thank you for dreaming big with us on the show today. And you have shared so much with me and our listeners. I'd love to ask for one more thing, and that is advice. Do you have any particular advice or inspiration that you want to leave us all with at the end of our conversation today?
The key piece of advice I always give young scientists is just keep going. I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing in a way. There are so many reasons not to do something. I saw a great cartoon recently where there was a picture of someone, and then there was at the end of a field about their goal, whatever that might be. And there were people with like baseball bats trying to stop them. And it could be your parents, it could be your boss, it could be your teachers, it could be your friends. Everybody can create barriers to us, can't they? Try to ignore all that. Keep your eye on that long-term goal. Keep reminding yourself of it. There's no harm in restating what you're trying to do. And it can be something small. It can be something big. I'm a great fan of the to-do list. Because you got to stay focused. And you need grit. The one trait you need in any walk of life to succeed is grit. You got to just get back up on the horse. So never feel that when you're failing or you're not getting anywhere, never feel that's the end. There's always a way out. And just keep at it and keep that dream in mind. And in other words, establish what your dream is. So you got to get your dream going. Yeah, so what do I want to do? In my case, it was to do biomedical research and then hopefully discover new medicines. That was always in the back of my mind. So establish your dream and never be put off and just keep going. That's the key piece of advice I'd give.
Wonderful advice, Luke. Thank you so much. And I know myself, I'm a to-do list addict, so I can attest to their effectiveness.
We all get the dopamine rush. Maybe when you tick it off, you see it's great.
Right. Well, thank you again so much. If our listeners want to learn more about you and the wonderful work you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so? Email
is the easiest way. That's the main mechanism. Or Twitter. I'm on Twitter as well, Marie, so you can try and catch me there too. But the simplest thing is you email me. It's laoneil@tcd.ie. You search for me to find me. So happy to address any emails that come in that might have questions. So there's no problem. I'm trying to address any questions that come up.
Excellent, Luke. We appreciate it. Listeners, definitely get in touch if you have any questions. Follow Luke on Twitter. And Luke, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Lovely. Thank you very much for very interesting questions you had for me there. So thanks for asking them.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us, listeners. Great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.